The eerie wrecks of the once proud Yukon River paddle steamers. All that's left of the gold rush era, when tens of thousands of would-be prospectors stampeded headlong into the adventure of a lifetime. The golden promise that once lured them still draws people to Canada's isolated northwest. Now, a team of underwater archaeologists investigates the forgotten fleet that made the Klondike Gold Rush possible. A new gold rush has erupted in the Yukon, Canada's westernmost territory bordering Alaska. The skyrocketing price of the precious metal propels adventurers deeper into the endless forests to seek their fortunes. They stake out random parcels on the off chance that the soil might hide some treasure. The claims aren't legal until the prospectors have marked the boundaries. With no room to land, prospecting takes a leap of faith. After literally staking their claims, they sometimes have to wander days through the wilderness to find a landing spot and get picked up. In an area where bears and caribou outnumber humans. This territory at the Arctic Circle has attracted adventurers for over 100 years. The rush began in 1896 near Dawson City. People the world over followed the Yukon's golden call to escape the economic recession. With nothing but misery at home, the promise of gold provided a glimmer of hope. They yearned to be like the men who, in August 1896, sank their gold pans into the freezing water and saw the shape of the future. The Yukon's gold rush ended more than 100 years ago, but apparently some folks never got the memo. Tony Kosuta came to the Klondike from what was then Yugoslavia in 1950. He was sure that the 19th century prospectors had left some undiscovered treasure behind.
In the Yukon, as far as I know, it's gold all over. Only it's not as much as we would like to have it. That's the whole problem with this gold mining.
It's August, and Tony is busy with the cleanup. He won't know what he has until he separates any gold dust and nuggets from the dirt.
I have 16 ounces last cleanup. This cleanup is very poor. I don't know if I have 10 ounces or something like that in it, it will be okay. But, and it takes lots of work.
The 84-year-old miner works 12 hours a day from June through August. The rest of the year, the soil's too frozen to dig. But time has proven him right. There's still gold in the creeks around Dawson.
Can you see 2 specks and one very, very small one? That's what we call color.
The first prospectors could pan $5,000 worth in a single day and pocket more than $1 million in a few months. The area around Klondike was one of the world's biggest gold fields, and there was no way to keep it a secret. In the summer of 1897, the news of the fabulous gold finds reached the rest of the world. Tens of thousands of people set off from the west coast cities of San Francisco and Seattle, most of them with no idea how long and arduous their journey would be. They could choose 2 main routes to Dawson, along the Pacific coast to the mouth of the Yukon River and then upstream, a distance of over 8,000 kilometers, or by ship to southern Alaska, on foot across the mountain passes, and then by boat down the Yukon, in total more than 3,000 kilometers. Either way, they'd find themselves sailing on the Yukon. In a language of the indigenous people, Yukon means Great River. The third longest watercourse on the continent meanders more than 3,700 kilometers across the remote Canadian Northwest. The wrecks of old, stranded ships litter its banks and riverbed, sad souvenirs of the era's hazards. National Geographic grantee John Pollock and his team are among the first researchers to examine these wrecks, a unique armada constructed specially for gold hunters.
In 1897, nearly 100,000 prospectors had to move north on the northern rivers in order to participate in the Klondike Gold Rush. In order to get them up here, shipwrights up and down the west coast built more than 130 sternwheelers. This was a unique situation that hasn't happened before. We now have an opportunity to study a derelict fleet of late 19th century sternwheelers and learn how they were constructed, and it's a situation we just don't have elsewhere in the world.
The river looks serene today, but over 100 years ago it churned with commotion. At each of its many bends, a fully loaded ship would sound its horn as it plied the waters. These wood-powered stern-wheel paddle steamers were state-of-the-art design in river navigation at the end of the 19th century. Their huge paddles could propel them over 24 kilometers per hour, and they could hold several hundred passengers. They conquered every mile of the long river, causing a rush hour in the Canadian wilderness. But the Yukon is not the Mississippi. Flowing up to 12 kilometers an hour and clogged with hidden sandbanks and jutting boulders, the river challenged the skills of even the best crews. Ships swept downstream in the fast current too often got raked against the rocks. For many, it was the highway of hope. But more than hopes were dashed along this river. No one knows exactly how many steamers the Yukon claimed. The archives brim with photographs of ships sinking and running aground. One of its victims, the paddle steamer SS Klondike, had a capacity of 300 tons and stretched 64 meters. It was one of the longest sternwheelers to have plied the Yukon. To figure out how this Goliath sank, John Pollock and his assistant Donnie Reed plunge into the ice-cold water. The bow still appears ship-shape. No signs of big leaks which could have brought the steamer down. Bit by bit, the two researchers feel their way along the hull of the largest freshwater wreck in Western Canada until they find a place to enter the bowels of the ship. John notices a significant design flaw: no bulkheads to stop the water.
All the big longitudinal bulkheads are built like these trusses. They're open. So when it was holed, the water was not going to be stopped by a solid bulkhead here. It came right across the engine compartment. I understand from the stories that they kept bumping on shore, and men would jump off with steel hawsers trying to put them on trees to stop this great ship. But the hawsers would be ripped off out of their hands. The trees would be ripped out of the banks. It continued down 6 to 8 kilometers, banging into things, becoming progressively more damaged, sinking lower in the water.
Why were there no watertight bulkheads?
It was this business of, speed versus strength. In the animal kingdom, sometimes you're better off if you can be fast and light.
Okay.
And this was often a preferred approach with stern-wheeler builders.
Despite countless accidents, in 1897 the shipping lines experienced their own gold rush as demand for paddle steamers exploded. One shipyard in Seattle built 12 simultaneously. Ship owners were as pressed for time as the gold hunters themselves. Whoever got to the Yukon first would make a killing. Yet not all steamers sailed to the Yukon. One actually took the land route. The owner of a steel foundry in Seattle had come up with a plan both ingenious and audacious. To get to the Yukon River as quickly as possible, he dismantled a paddle steamer completely. Then he, his wife, and some helpers carried the thousands of pieces on the shortest and most direct path to where the river rises. And that meant over the mountain passes of southern Alaska.
Let's wait for the others.
With the U.S. in an economic depression, the gold rush offered Albert and Clara Goddard a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a fast fortune.
Do you want some?
Yes, please.
They hoped that by taking the direct but hazardous route to the gold fields, they'd beat the major shipping lines to the Yukon.
Let's keep moving!
So the small convoy set off on a trek along the poor man's route, following the same arduous path as the gold hunters who couldn't afford a ticket on the big paddle steamers. The Goddard's land route trimmed more than 3,200 kilometers off the all-water route, but it required a hike over the mountaintops of southern Alaska to reach the headwaters of the Yukon River. In winter, temperatures here dropped to -45 Celsius. In some places, the snowy trail shrunk to less than 60 centimeters wide. One false step meant tumbling to one's death. Hundreds of horses perished in the deep canyons of the so-called Dead Horse Trail. One prospector said the horses were deliberately jumping to end their misery. About half the gold hunters threw in the towel before they reached the top of the mountain. These entrepreneurs had been warned by newspapers about the hardship of their undertaking. But most were blinded by the Yukon's golden opportunity. The Goddards were no exception. But when they reached the first steep faces, they must have had second thoughts. A seemingly endless chain of people laden with tons of provisions climbed the steep snow-covered slope. The Chilkoot Pass, with its 1,500 stairs carved into the ice, became the symbol of the adversity people had to overcome. The trekkers had named them the Golden Stairs. The White Pass and the Chilkoot Pass are the only northbound passages through the mountain range in southern Alaska. And along with countless other gold hunters, the Goddards continued trudging upward. One of the men who crossed the mountain around the same time wrote, "My feet are sore, my heels are blistered, my legs sore and lame. My hands, neck, and shoulders are sore and chafed from rope. But boys, don't think I'm discouraged. There is a golden glimmer in the distance." Some of the wannabe prospectors had no idea what they were in for. They dragged strange things like pianos and bicycles up the mountain. Compared to those, the ship parts the Goddards loaded onto their sleds didn't attract much attention.
What a brilliant idea.
But a century later, it did catch the attention of John Pollock, who's always been fascinated by the Goddard story. In 1901, the couple's small steamer, the A.J. Goddard, is said to have sunk where the Yukon meets Lake LaBerge. Divers have tried in vain to locate the Goddard in its waters. Then, amateur archaeologist Doug Davidge discovered a shipwreck on the lakebed that he believes could be it. John and Doug now want to check the wreckage to see if he's right. From the few known pictures, the A.J. Goddard looks like a miniature model of the large sternwheelers.
A vessel that you literally can order from a catalog, and a number of firms back around 1900 offered mail order sternwheeler kits that you could put together yourself if you had fairly decent mechanical skills, and it's possible the A.J. Goddard may be one of these vessels.
To determine if the wrecked ship is the Goddard, John Pollock makes another dive, this time accompanied by archaeologist Lindsay Thomas from Texas A&M University. It's early June and the water temperature hovers just above freezing, a challenge for any diver. But the researchers have chosen this time of year to take advantage of the best visibility. In spring, the ice has just melted and the water flows crystal clear. This year, however, spring came early to the Yukon. A record-breaking warm spell melted the ice in mid-May, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The brooks have washed sediments from the mountains into the lake, clouding the water. Still, even at first glance, the divers are impressed. Like a time capsule, the ship lies almost perfectly preserved on the lakebed. The paddle wheel at the stern is nearly intact. The ice-cold water has halted decomposition. The divers identify the heavy drive arm, which the captain had to shift to reverse the paddle wheel. This may be the only ship of its kind left in North America.
It's an exceptional ship, a truly exceptional ship for its preservation quality. The majority of the shipwrecks that we have are destroyed. We don't have anything even close to this. Descending upon the wreck, it's really evident right away that it's a very small vessel. Everything about it, it feels like you could fit right in, that you could walk on the deck and operate everything right away. Whereas on a normal vessel, when you go down on it, you can barely see what's happening or understand what it is because it's so big.
If this ship truly is the A.J. Goddard, as John and Lindsay believe, the proof may be in the artifacts the divers bring up. The artifacts from the wreck provide conservator Valerie Monahan a close-up look into the past. It's a magnifying glass, indispensable for a prospector examining gold dust. Perhaps equally important, a whiskey bottle to help cope with the cold. They also find some gramophone records, bringing a civilized voice to the wilderness surrounding them.
Albert?
The gramophone was invented 10 years before the gold rush. The iPod of its day, for many it was the only diversion on the laborious route to Dawson City. On the Goddard's trek, 17 people died during one night alone. We don't know how the survivors coped. Perhaps music helped Clara and Albert take their minds off their anguish.
What do you think? How much time do we need?
To the summit? Another day, I think.
The closer they got to the peak, the greater the strain became. For every person who struggled on, one gave up. At the camp, the divers measure the wreckage. The ship stretches 17 meters long and 3 meters wide. All evidence suggests this small paddle steamer really is the Goddard, the first untouched vessel from the gold rush discovered underwater.
We saw a ship and measured a length that is consistent with the historical documentation on the A.J. Goddard, so the length checks out. We also saw hog post and chain stays. We saw the cross-bracing system there that you see in the photos, and that checks out. So I think we're 99.9% sure this is the Goddard. That's confirmed.
Piece by piece, the vessel surrenders its artifacts. One of the biggest objects is the 1.8 meter long iron steam pipe with an attached chime whistle. The pipe is the correct size for the valve, but the valve could have also serviced a larger boiler system. Apparently, Albert Goddard picked up some of the items off the shelf. He had to take what he could get, make it fit, and get up north as quickly as possible.
Boy, it looks in really good shape, though.
This is fantastic.
Slowly, the underwater investigators reveal a little more of the one-of-a-kind ship and the story of the owners. Among the well-preserved remains, the divers look for clues as to what happened in the ship's final moments 109 years earlier. Their investigation leads them to the boiler.
They probably turned their efforts to starting the fire in the firebox. We believe that the fire had been put out by waves crossing the deck, and this is the reason now we see one of the boiler doors open. The firebox door of the boiler is jammed with unburned wood, and it was clear that they were trying to get the fuel to ignite so they could have steam, so they could have power, and without power in a vessel like this in a big storm, the vessel would turn broadside in the waves and you would sink.
When the wreck sank, it fortunately didn't capsize, making it easier for the researchers to verify that the Goddard worked the same way as the large Yukon steamboats. The paddle is mounted at the stern, drive arms connected to the engine. The custom-built boiler is the smallest ever found on a steamer in North America. The divers can still make out the manufacturer's name on a faded plate. Albert Goddard had certainly spent some time thinking about how best to equip his ship for the Yukon.
One of the things that we were surprised about was that boiler. It's very small. It's what we call a water tube boiler, and they're not that common. It would be a lightweight unit, ideal if you were having to haul pieces of a ship over mountain passes. That's the boiler you'd choose.
Although the boiler and the other parts were unusually small for a steamer, the Goddard was still a 40-ton ship. Albert and Clara Goddard had to haul every bit of it over the mountain, along with their normal provisions. The border between Alaska on the U.S. side and Canada's British Columbia runs along the mountain ridge. Some entrepreneurs set up posts there to wrangle the last dollars out of the freezing gold seekers. A cup of thin coffee and a stale donut cost $2.50, 5 times the price of a 3-course meal in Seattle. But the prospectors were happy to get something warm inside them after the long trudge. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police established a border post at the top of the pass to check the equipment of anyone who wanted to cross into Canada.
Is that everything you need?
So far. No, please show me how much provisions you've got.
Enough for 6 months, at least.
The Canadian government issued a new decree that winter. Anyone traveling to Dawson had to prove they had a year's supply of food, adding over 450 kilograms to their equipment. It wasn't harassment. It would take a ton of equipment to survive in the Yukon subarctic wilderness. Many of the trekkers just didn't realize that they were headed for a place where they could buy nothing for all the money in the world, and that they'd probably stay there longer than planned. The few hundred men who had reached Dawson before the winter spent day after day rinsing gold in their long sluices. By now, some had struck it rich. In the winter of 1897, the small settlement near the Arctic Circle had the highest density of millionaires in the world. Yet they had nothing to spend it on. They had dwindling food, tattered clothes, and no female companionship. But women and food were on their slow way over the mountain to satisfy the rugged new millionaires, who were also running low on patience. This second wave of people was eager to reach Dawson. But once they finally crossed the mountain, they still had to find a way down the Yukon River.
Oh, what's on the other sleds?
A paddle steamer.
A paddle what? A steamer? The ice on the Yukon will not thaw until May. At the earliest. That means 3 months from now, eh?
Just enough time to assemble a steamer. Come on, folks. What you see here is only our first load. Let's go!
Each would-be prospector had to make up to 40 trips back and forth across the pass. Although no records document how many crossings the Goddards made, the burden of carrying their dismantled ship certainly multiplied the length of their journey to Lake Bennett, the headwaters of the Yukon River. Now, John Pollock's on his way to the lake, 140 kilometers from his team's diving camp.
They're just coming in over the Chilkoot Pass, approaching the Lake Bennett.
It takes the small aircraft just a few minutes to fly over the passes where so many gold hunters despaired. At the foot of the mountain lies Lake Bennett. Those who reached the lake had cleared the first hurdle on their way to Dawson.
Have you seen many remains of the gold rush on Lake Bennett? That is very deep water, so it's not easy to spot any of the wrecks from the air.
No one knows the exact place on the lakeshore where the Goddards assembled their ship. But John hopes to find some of the metal construction debris that might have survived the elements. Almost 21 meters of snow fell that winter. The wind blew relentlessly, and with each crossing, the load on their backs grew heavier and heavier. They sweated and froze at the same time, but they couldn't wash or change their clothes. Both brutalized and empowered, people came here not just for gold, but to seize their own destiny in a world on the cusp of a new century. Men in their mid-20s made up the great majority. But not only young men followed their dream to strike it rich. This route was the most concentrated mass movement of Americans onto Canadian soil in history. And in terms of getting to the gold fields, it was probably the toughest. But it also turned out to be the most effective way to go. Against great odds, the Goddards and their helpers arrived at the lake where the Yukon begins. They they weren't alone. Some 22,000 people managed to cross the mountain passes into Canada. These new arrivals erected the largest tent city in the world. Tens of thousands of prospectors spent months at the lakeside, each one of them either building his own boat from native trees or helping others in return for a place on board. The once quiet lake came alive with the sound of sawing and hammering. But one ship stood out among them, the steamer A.J. Goddard. This photograph shows Clara Goddard posing proudly in front of her miniature steamer on the southern shore of Lake Bennett. It gives John his first clue. The Goddards must have picked this spot when they came down from the mountain. After a quick search, John finds some metal plates on the beach. They contain small rivet holes for joining the plates together. Remarkably, the holes seem to fit the rivets John's divers discovered in the metal sheets at the wreck of the Goddard. Thousands of rivets had been knocked into the hull and the deck to construct the ship. Some rusty ones still lie scattered on the beach.
This material matches the general dimensions of what's on the A.J. Goddard. I'm pretty sure, given its location and given what I'm holding in my hands and given its characteristics, that we've found the place of its construction.
Other than the remnants of an old wooden platform, John found no signs of anything else the Goddards might have used to build their ship. So how did Albert Goddard manage to assemble a 40-ton ship with his bare hands?
He would have had a small number of men, maybe a couple, plus himself, plus his wife. And they had to put the pieces of this prefabricated ship together, rivet them together, assemble everything out in the open as you see it now. It's possible they had a small tent, but it would have been pretty brutal.
To see how the ship was designed, the divers set up a sonar probe next to the wreck. It's technology commonly used to construct oil platforms. The sonar grabs three-dimensional images of underwater objects, even in murky waters. Albert Goddard divided the ship into 5 separate small compartments. This modular design let him assemble the steamer with fewer hands. The design also made it safer. A leaky compartment could be sealed off quickly. Without any help from cranes or welding machines, Albert managed to put together a tailor-made paddle steamer to be proud of. The equipment found at the wreck shows more of Albert's careful planning. He even included a small forge to make on-the-spot repairs. The Goddards cooked on this small stove, the only warm place on a ship barely protected by a canvas cover.
The artifacts do show that life aboard the ship wasn't easy, and the ship itself shows that. There's nowhere to live inside the ship. You had to live on the deck, and so as we're excavating, we're finding pots, pans, dishes, a stove, but it was all outside. It wasn't protected, and it was cold and probably very difficult.
Albert apparently thought of everything, except comfort. And yet, spots aboard the A.J. Goddard were highly coveted. But what choice did people have? There were no paths or roads along the banks of the Yukon, just impenetrable forest. The river was the only transport route both in summer and winter. Some folks wouldn't wait for the ice to melt. and set off on the 800-kilometer-long route in vessels that were half boat and half sled. Most everyone else held out for the day the ice broke. At the end of May, the most peculiar fleet in history set out down the river to Dawson City. 7,000 ragtag vessels on an 800-kilometer voyage in sub-zero weather. Many were just fortified rafts, floating coffins, the gold hunters called them. In the current, they rushed headlong across the gorges and over rapids. 150 boats sank during the first couple of days. 19 of them smashed to pieces against the same killer boulder. But the Goddard made it, one of the first steamers to reach Dawson safe and sound after a voyage of 4 days and 21 hours. The prospectors she carried won a small lead in the race for the best claims. The Goddards had made a name for themselves. Albert and Clara established one of the first regular services on the upper Yukon even before the large steamers reached Dawson over the following weeks. Their tenacity paid off. The same could be said for Tony Kosuta.
You see, I started on here, and that's the way is the best for you when you come into one creek to stake at the hole, and then you don't have no problem. Then you have no problem.
Tony has staked 20 claims over the years. He mainly works alone, except for a few days in August when his friend Joseph helps wash out the soil. He'll pitch in as long as Tony keeps at it. So basically, he has a job for life.
If he would retire and do nothing, he began within 1 year, getting fatter and ill and die. But he's active, energizing, goes, and that keep him alive. Now he's 84-year-old. He still figure he gonna do some more mining next year.
Though Tony works hard, his business model couldn't be simpler. No employees, no risks. The Caterpillar is his only investment. But this is the 21st century, and Tony's neighbors 48 kilometers away do things a little differently. At one of the largest mining operations in the area, up to 20 people work around the clock from June through September. The permafrost puts the kibosh on winter work. But during those 4 busy months, the earth moves at Tara Christie's camp. The machines burn 140,000 liters of fuel per day. If the fuel truck is late or a conveyor belt breaks, the company loses thousands of dollars per day. But aside from the scale of their operations, Tony and Tara aren't so different.
I believe there's lots of gold. There's lots of placer gold here that's still to be found. There's lots of creeks that haven't been mined, which the increase in gold prices certainly makes those creeks economic. There's also been some hard rock sources, or potential hard rock sources that have been found in recent years. Notably one last year that's only 60 kilometers away from here, which people think might have been one of the major sources for placer gold in this area. That's pretty exciting.
Some people believe the sound of gold rattling in the pan causes gold fever. Others say it's the shiny seduction that makes people fall. But the bottom line is the bottom line. The rising value of gold has reinvigorated the Klondike gold industry around a city it built a century ago, where once stood endless forests. In 1898, the population of Dawson boomed to over 25,000, and the former tent camp now rivaled Seattle in numbers. For the first time, banks, electric lights, and steam-heated rooms came to this Canadian wilderness. And it all got there by paddle steamer. The Yukon flows past Dawson at a place the locals call the Bone Yard. It's a ship cemetery, the final resting place of several wrecked and abandoned paddle steamers. Like all cemeteries, it's a lively spot for an archaeologist. John Pollock has taken a particular interest in the wreckage of the Seattle III, built during the peak of the gold rush in 1898, when the shipping companies were eager to maximize cargo space. To do that, they had to build sturdier steamers. They fitted the Seattle III with massive longitudinal girders, making her the most rugged ship on the Yukon, and also the heaviest on record. Rolling on the river became more than a little problematic.
Some of the vessels averaged 150 to 160 feet in length. They were loaded with freight, they were loaded with a certain number of passengers, and then they tacked a 100-foot-long freight barge fully loaded on front of them, which they would push. You now had a structure exceeding 250 feet in length that you had to take down a narrow, shallow, curving river.
Where the Yukon narrows, the current can flow perilously fast. The Five Finger Rapids became a notorious danger zone. The puny engines on these Leviathan sternwheelers didn't have the brawn to fight the strong current. So the captains used their brains. They ran steel cables called hawsers through hooks fixed on the banks and used a winch to tow their ship upstream. And that's how even the heaviest steamers cleared the most dangerous passages on the Yukon. With the nearest dockyard more than 1,600 kilometers away, ships coming to the Yukon had to be ready for any eventuality. An ill-prepared captain could find himself up the creek. To his credit, the captain of the Seattle III carried a store of spare parts below deck.
This is the same situation when you go on the road with your vehicle. You don't go out there without a spare tire. In this case, the vessel had 4 great balanced rudders. This is one of them. There's another spare lying here. If you didn't have these materials and you damaged your rudders, you damaged your paddle wheel, that was it. You were stuck.
The ship operators gradually learned the ways of the treacherous river. Travel time became shorter, and the demand for passage to Dawson remained high. In the meantime, Canada's Northwest had started to attract people who didn't come to look for gold, but to spend it. Wealthy tourists flocked to see the nouveau riche city in the wilderness. The standards for accommodation and catering improved. A touch of elegance graced even the steamers. As much as the Yukon allowed. But despite the linens and servants, no one ever mistook a cramped paddle steamer for a luxury liner. About 340 kilometers south of Dawson, the wreck of the Evelyn lies in the undergrowth of an islet known as Shipyard Island. Her operator had her hauled to shore to avoid the ice and eventually abandoned her.
Wow.
Look at that.
Look how thin the floorboards are.
Let me just look back here and see if I can see anything more, but be careful.
Yeah.
You don't want to go through the deck.
I'm watching where I step.
The planks of the deck are rotten beyond repair. It won't be long before the Evelyn collapses. John Pollock is surprised to find that despite the disintegration, the ship's rudders still work perfectly.
Not hard.
Look at that.
100 years old, and it still turns easily.
That's incredible workmanship.
Shipyard Island, the Evelyn's final resting place, was a regular stop for many ships heading to Dawson, which earned the nickname Paris of the North. Improved traveling conditions and positive word of mouth brought more and more visitors there. Few places in North America had more to offer during that time. Gold became the official currency, and every shop had a small gold scale on its counter. The wealthy sipped champagne under the light of chandeliers and danced through the night. And the ones still looking for gold gazed in amazement at the newly minted millionaires, now called Klondike Kings. Prospectors became glamorous, as if they had tapped into a never-ending rain of gold that might solve the worries of the world. Those who had made it became living legends, arriving poor and striking it rich. The Klondike Gold Rush was the stuff of the American dream. But from the 100,000 who had set out for the Yukon, only a few hundred found enough gold to live on. After only 3 years, Dawson's golden age was over. Many came too late. The best claims had already been staked. And losing the great race to the Klondike wasn't the worst of it. Once there, prospectors faced typhoid, malaria, frostbite, and scurvy. Some didn't even make enough money for the long journey home. The steamer crews paid a heavy price too. The A.J. Goddard sank during a storm in October 1901. 5 people were aboard. 3 died. But Clara and Albert Goddard weren't among them. Shrewd in business to the end, they'd sold their ship at the height of the gold rush in 1899. By the time she sank, they'd returned to Seattle. With a pioneering spirit, they blazed a trail for later generations to follow. Today, Tony Kosuta is the old hand among the Klondike gold hunters. But even he can't tell if his 4 months of hard labor will pay off. The tally comes at the end of the season, when the gold smelter in Dawson processes his nuggets to a gold bar. Funny thing about gold, though, finding a lot whets your appetite for more. During the first decade of the 2000s, as more and more investors decided that cash is good, but gold is better, the only currency considered crisis-proof reached record highs, whipping stock exchanges and the gold hunters into a frenzy. Around the turn of the millennium, an ounce of gold was worth $280. In March 2011, it traded at $1,400. The bar still contains some slag and sand. A second smelting will purify it. In the end, this bar will contain just over 2.7 kilograms of pure gold, valued at roughly $120,000. Tony may not strike it rich, but at least he can afford to move to a warm apartment in town during the winter. His claims are his financial security. But over the years, he's come to realize that it isn't the material value of gold that he treasures.
I like this freedom, which is one of the best things that a man can possess. Freedom. That you have nobody over your head telling you what to do.
The pace is a lot slower in Dawson today. Only 1,300 people live here, just a fraction of the town's former population. The mighty river, once crowded, is quiet now, but that could change in a heartbeat. For years, a rumor has circulated that the mother lode still waits to be discovered. If that's true, the Yukon is insane.